Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was actually at the conference last year as well, but we probably don't recognize each other. We were wearing masks most of the time. I'm a professor, but emeritus from Ulster University. Emeritus means that I can still do work, but they don't pay me anymore. So that's one of the problems. What I want to talk about today is if you're a designer or a developer of a chatbot or a conversational assistant, whatever you want to call it, you have to make various choices, and these will determine what your chatbot will be able to do. And the reasons why you make these choices is that you're paying attention to the requirements, the needs of your users. We had an excellent talk just now about why that is very important, and also about the sort of technology that you're going to be using as well. So I want to outline very briefly a sort of a framework that I've been developing that explains that in a bit more detail. And then I'll move on to a case study. It's a chatbot called ChatPal, which we have developed in a research and development project. I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute, for mental health support. I'll talk a little bit then about how we gathered requirements, how we implemented the chatbot, how we evaluated it with user studies and feedback, and then I'll outline some of the lessons that we learned from all of that. So when people talk about the complexity of a system, of a conversational system, they usually have a one-dimensional view of it going from simple to complex. But I would like to argue that we really have about three different dimensions that we need to look at. Firstly, we need to look at how the interaction is handled. Then we need to look at how the language input and output and other modalities are handled, the various choices there as well. And then we need to look at to what extent the system makes use of external knowledge and demonstrates some sort of intelligence. So looking first at interaction, the conversation flow, if we're talking about a conversation, can be very simple. In fact, at the level of a one-shot query, there really isn't a conversation. It's a question answer, and then it goes on to maybe a different question and answer and so on. A slight variation on that is a one-shot query with a follow-up. So you might have a question that says, what's the weather in Frankfurt today? And you get the answer, and then you say, and what about London? And it's quite a complex technology to do that, because you have to link the entities in the previous query and determine that the second query is relevant in some way, and then substitute in that case London for Frankfurt. That's more or less working now in Amazon, Alexa, and Google Assistant and so on. So those sort of things are okay. Generally within industry, people develop a predetermined conversation flow where you have a dialogue graph. That can be handy for fairly simple interactions, but it can quite quickly get out of hand and actually explode exponentially. And it's also very inflexible, because the system can, and the user can only really sort of follow the path that has been predetermined. Within AI, in the old days of AI, going back to maybe the 70s and 80s, and I remember that myself, there was a lot of work done on planning and reasoning. And so dialogues would develop where, for example, the system was trying to work out what the user was planning to do, and there'd be a lot of dialogue that automatically developed around that. More recently, the technique that's been developed a lot is to optimize the dialogue flow, where there's a series of choices based on reinforcement learning. I'll not go into the details of that. It's very complex technology, but it's it gives a much more flexible interaction, and it is optimized according to user feedback, basically at the end of each dialogue. And then finally, there's neural dialogue-based conversation flow, and I'll mention that a little bit later. Conversation initiative, who controls the dialogue? Again, the simplest one, and you'll see that's what we actually used in our project, is for the system to take the initiative. And so it prompts and asks questions, makes statements, and so on. The other extreme is to have user initiative, where the user asks questions, like in the one-shot exchanges. And then the more complex one is where you have mixed initiative, which is rather more like human conversation. Then we can have personalization. So the system may have a persona. That's quite a popular thing now in commercial projects. And also it may maintain some sort of model of the user, what the user likes to do, what the user's habits are, whether the user has been ill, for example, in certain types of application, or in commercial ones, what products they are interested in. In most cases, we see systems that are reactive to user input, but you can also get systems being proactive, where they will generate some sort of output, perhaps like a reminder or a sales pitch or something. And then finally, we have what is called state tracking, which is all part of the interaction, where the system maintains the context, typically of what's been discussed so far, but it may be much more wide range, and it may be the context of the environment. And another project I'm involved in, we're using sensors to track aspects of the user's environment, their global environment and wearable information, and that is all part then of what can feed in to the subsequent dialogue. So looking at language, well, we can have multimodal systems, or that can have all sorts of inputs and outputs. Again, we heard about some of that yesterday in the Mila presentation. We can have text-based ones, which is in fact what our chatbot was about, or we can have speech, or we can have mixtures. The user input can be handled in a very simple way. Again, you'll see in our project we used quick replies or buttons. That keeps it very simple. It can be constrained in some way. So for example, in IVRs, you quite often got interactions where the system said you have three choices, say savings account, checking account, or business account, for example, or say yes or no. Doesn't always work, actually. A long time ago, there was a project that talked about yes or no, and the question the system asked was, are you married? And the answer came, unfortunately, which they hadn't predicted. You can then have it constrained by being specific to a particular domain. So if it's about flight bookings, you're not going to be able to ask anything about football scores and so on. Or it can be totally open domain, like in Maximilian's talk yesterday. We saw how people could ask questions about virtually anything, and actually normally got a good response. And so from the system output, it can be predetermined. It might just be strings that are specified and don't change. It can be based on a template where information, the variables that are collected during the conversation are then inserted into a template. Or again, it can be, as Maximilian illustrated yesterday, it can be based on the use of a large language model, which then generates generally a very open-ended response. And then finally, knowledge. Well, you could have chatbots that don't really access any background knowledge. The original Eliza was like that. It simply talked and didn't really have any knowledge about anything at all, but just reflected back things to the user. More generally, people have databases and more recently knowledge graphs that are accessed then within the particular domain. Or indeed, you could actually have open access to the internet or to language models. And then the tasks can range from notification, which usually isn't a dialogue at all, it's simply just telling you something, FAQs, simple Q&As, advanced Q&As, slot filling, and like in situations like Lambda or applications like Lambda, the Google Lambda, you can have an open domain virtual personal assistant that in theory can talk to you about anything. So this little diagram is really the theme of what I want to talk about. We have to look first of all at what people need and want. So that's the user requirements. In the particular ones where we have professionals involved, so in our example, carers and mental health professionals, also what they will endorse as being useful. And then also we have to look at what we can actually do with the technology. So there's a sort of intersection in this little Venn diagram. So coming now to the project, Chatbot. This was a project within the European horizon, but more specifically within the Northern Periphery and Arctic program, which then deals with countries that are actually outside the middle parts of Europe. And you can see it's the ones that I've highlighted here in dark green on the map. So we had Northern Ireland, where I'm from. The Republic of Ireland was a partner in Cork. So we're seen as being peripheral in Europe, and actually now we're outside. Then we had partners from Finland, Sweden, and interestingly from the Western Isles of Scotland. And one of our challenges was then to actually develop a multilingual chatbot. So we had English, Finnish, Swedish, and Scottish Gaelic. And we engaged in extensive requirements gathering to determine what sort of a chatbot we should develop. Originally, it was actually going to be a voice-enabled chatbot, and we called the project VoicePal. But on the first evaluation for the funding, we were discouraged from using speech technology. It was perhaps seen as being a little bit too ambitious at the time with the resources that we were allocated, and so it became a text-based one. The professionals saw a variety of things. So if you're looking at the blue and the green, you can see that it might help people manage their condition. We're talking about remote areas where people didn't have daily access, say, to professional care, and this would then compensate and complement any care that they might receive. Education, training, counseling, and so on. They also mentioned screening and diagnosing, but we excluded those as being too difficult to challenge, again, within the resource, and also liable to be a little bit unsafe. There are lots of examples of that in the literature. Some of the things that users said they would like to do to be able to handle their problems, their anxiety, their insomnia, to be able to measure how well they were doing in certain measures, to be able to track their moods, to be a companion that would keep them chatting and engaged, so they didn't feel too lonely, to ask them about how they're doing, and generally to be friendly and empathetic and understanding. So the publications I put there go into a lot more detail. I've just really picked a few of examples really of the sort of things that we got information about when we were doing the gathering of the user requirements. And they were both from the professional point of view of the stakeholders, the carers, and also then from the users, the potential users themselves. It was a little bit difficult to do all of this during the pandemic, but anyway, it was we did achieve that. Now, as I say, we didn't actually develop it for diagnosis, and the main aim was to promote mental well-being using a theory of positive psychology called PERMA, which looked at things like positive emotion, engagement, relationships, and so on. There were also sections to do with mindfulness and breathing and mood logging, and gratitude and thoughts diaries. And we developed this using the Rasa conversational AI framework. I won't have time to go into the details of that, but the front end was a smartphone, Android or iOS. And then Rasa was then the back end, really, or the we had the two main components, the NLU to interpret the input, and then the Rasa core, which then decided on what actions and responses the system should make. And then there were various repositories and so on to hold data that was gathered during the interactions. So here's an example, very simple example of an initial dialogue with Chatpal, where it's asking what you would like to do next, and it gives a series of buttons that can be clicked on. As I say, it was also possible to enter input, but that functionality was fairly limited. And one of the reasons for that was because it was a multilingual chatbot, and particularly in Scottish Gaelic, we didn't have the resource for that. It might have been possible in Swedish and Finnish, but with Scottish Gaelic it wasn't. So what we did, we actually manually translated all the system prompts and outputs into the relevant language, and of course the little buttons as well. So there was some NLU interpretation, but not really an awful lot. At the beginning of the interaction, people were asked which language they wanted to use. And here, I'm sure you all understand Scottish Gaelic. I don't really myself, but I managed to get this example together. The thing would then proceed using Scottish Gaelic. Now, initially in the concept, the overall conversation was envisaged as a dialogue tree, and yeah, well, you can't really see that, but you can see that it's quite complicated and quite unwieldy, and actually impossible really to translate that easily into code. It would be quite horrendous and actually very liable to fall apart. So what we were able to do was to take subtrees of this or subflows, so little tiny bits, and to create what in Rasa are called stories. That's a declarative representation of a dialogue flow, which basically will have the user input that's interpreted as an intent, possibly some action or custom action for things the system might do, like looking up things and so on, and then a response. So it has those components, and this boiled down into about 500 different stories. And when Chatpal got an input from the user, which was normally by clicking on one of the buttons, it would take that and classify it as an intent. There were about 180 of those. And there could be a lot of ambiguity within the system, but one of the strengths of Rasa is that over time, what is called the transformer-based dialogue policy will learn the best mappings from the intents into the stories. And so a whole dialogue would then be pieced together from these little bits of dialogue that were represented as stories. Now, looking at the feedback then from the users, one of the disappointing things was that we didn't really have a very high retention rate. So the blue line indicates using the system at least once for these different applications, some of them more popular than others. The red multiple times, but as you can see, really the retention rate wasn't really all that high. I think the pandemic didn't really help with that. But that was a little bit disappointing. This indicates how useful people found the system, and the green lines are indicating very useful. The red bad, but there's not too much red in this case, so that's not so bad. We then interviewed participants to see how much they felt that the chatbot had helped them, and you can see that roughly 50% responded saying that it did actually help. Most of the rest felt it didn't make any difference really, and then a small number of people thought, well, it wasn't really much use at all. Well, we did then objective measures using these various scales. And again, you can see roughly that starting at the baseline, we did indicate some sort of improvement. More importantly, then we took interviews with the users, and I'd like to just look at the implications of some of these. The first one was indicating that because there were a lot of female users as well, it would be interesting if we could actually have a system that could adapt to different genders. Now, that's not too difficult with two genders, but of course nowadays you might have more. But from a technical point of view, it could be difficult, because if you wanted it to adapt to a female person, then you're stereotyping females has all been the same and all wanted a certain type of interaction, and males has been different and so on. So it's all right just to say you would like this sort of difference, but it mightn't just be quite so easy to realize that. Another one was that it should actually remember the last conversation or the last mood and so on, and develop a personality. Again, that's a challenging sort of thing to do, and it's also a bit contradictory, because some users said they didn't like the fact that the user was storing information about them. But then if it didn't do that, then it couldn't do these things that they were also saying they wanted to happen, that it would remember what they'd talked about on some previous occasion. Again, a little bit similar, that it would adapt based on the user feedback and maybe change the order of the conversations. We didn't actually get as far as doing that, but a more flexible system would then be able to take account of way conversations went before and then modify them. Ours was a little bit linear really at the end of the day. Although you could jump about a little bit within it, it was fairly linear, and you didn't really get much. If you went through the system a few times, it wasn't going to be any different than the next week. It was going to be fairly similar. Well, we collected moods at the start of each session, but they could have been collected at the end. That would be a fairly simple thing to do. And we could also have been calculating scores. We did have this chart that they could look at, and they would score things. And it wouldn't have been too difficult to display that at the end of the session. So as you can see there, we developed user requirements. We then tried to implement according to those and according to the resources we had available to us, which were fairly restricted, particularly in terms of the multilinguality. And then we did evaluations. So lessons learned. As you can see, you can develop at different levels of complexity. Our system was fairly simple. The level depends really on things like the user requirements and the technology available. It's important that users are involved throughout. But users can be inconsistent. So nowadays, a lot of them have Alexa or Google Assistant, and so they have higher expectations than what we can develop in a small project. And sometimes, conversely, they actually don't realize what you can do, and so their expectations are not very high. So thank you for listening. I'll just point out we have a conference coming up in Belfast in next June. It's gone. There it is. If you're particularly interested in this topic. Thank you for listening.